Greetings there, academic proletariat, and welcome to this episode of the Fireside Chats with Mr. Rosen, where we will be talking about the Progressive Presidency and those presidents who served between 1901 and roughly 1920. So to get this party started, we're going to go ahead and take a couple steps back, and we're going to talk about politics during the Gilded Age. Now, as you can imagine, politics during the Gilded Age is characterized by a very laissez-faire government atmosphere. Okay, from 1870 to 1900, government did very, very little domestically. Its job was like to deliver the mail, to maintain the military, to collect taxes and tariffs, to conduct a foreign policy. That was it. And basically, these things it didn't really do in large capacity even then. Okay, the one exception was that it was tasked with administering the annual Civil War veterans pension, which it didn't do. Okay, so anyways, the presidency was more of a symbolic office. Party bosses ruled the day, like Boss Tweed, a guy in New York by the name of Senator Roscoe Conkling, who's actually the senator, was a party boss. So the presidents didn't really have a lot of power in the early Gilded Age. So the party bosses and the climate basically thought the president should avoid offending anybody within their own party and should leave the party bosses alone. So in order to make the party bosses happy, the presidents just handed out federal jobs at their whim. To give you sort of an idea, in 1865, even after the massive growth of the federal government during the Civil War, there were only 53,000 people who worked for the federal government. Only, I know I say that. You small government people out there are going to tell me that's a lot, but it really isn't that much, because in 1890 there were 166,000 people who worked for the federal government. That means it grew by a lot of percent. What that's like, it triples. Okay, so that's a big increase. Okay, so now to give you sort of an idea on how the presidential elections work, you don't need to remember these or remember the names, because nobody remembers the names. I'm going to prove it to you in a second. Actually, I proved it to you already, because on number 3 on your Progressive President Guided Notes, you should have written down the names of the 4 Gilded Age presidents, none of which you knew who they were. Maybe you knew who Garfield was, and we'll get to why in a second. Or you read Destiny of the Republic, which is an awesome book that just came out on him. If you haven't read it, you should. Okay, anyways, that plug over. In 1880, there was an election where James Garfield won. And James Garfield wins. And if you look, it's sort of not close in the Electoral College. And the popular vote is like almost the same. So it shows that people are kind of, up in the air about who the president should be. Anyways, as the sort of status quo, if you win the North, you win the election. Okay? Sad day, a year after he's elected, James Garfield is assassinated. He's killed by a crazy man named Charles Guiteau, who asked Garfield for a job. Garfield said no. Guiteau shot him. Chester Arthur takes over and vows to end political patronage. Why would he want to do that? He doesn't want to get shot. So he passes the Pendleton Act in 1883, which is a civil service act. It's nicknamed the Magna Carta of Civil Service Reform. Civil service is working for the government in a very reductionist kind of definition. Anyways, in 1883, 14,000 of the 117,000 federal government jobs became civil service exam positions, meaning you needed to pass an exam to get that job. It couldn't just be handed to you by the president. And then finally, in 1900, so in the years after the Pendleton Act was enacted, half of federal government jobs were civil service jobs. So it's basically giving people a fair shot at being in the government. It's not just who you know anymore. Okay, now this causes some disgruntled people within the Republican Party to speak up, because they don't like the fact that Arthur did this. And so they become known as Mugwumps. Great name. You want to insult somebody, you call them a Mugwump. Mugwumps were reformers who didn't want to renominate Arthur, so they threw their nomination towards somewhere else. They wanted to reform, and I put that in air quotes. So reform to them looked like an impartial government that's run by business elite, like themselves. They tended to be social Darwinists, and they tended to favor laissez-faire, spoil system patronage, basically everything that had happened before the Pendleton Act. Now, even though these mugwumps sort of have a small constituency, there seems to be a changing in the public opinion. Americans are looking to the federal government to start to solve their issues. They want to see them break up trusts. They want to see them solve social and economic issues. And the government listens. They pass the Interstate Commerce Act in 1883, which allows the government to regulate railroad companies a little bit more. They pass the Sherman Antitrust Act, which tries to regulate monopolies but does a very, very terrible job, and it's turned on unions instead. Sad day. And they passed the McKinley tariff, which is the highest tariff in history. Okay, now if you recall from earlier fireside chats, a tariff is a tax placed on imports. It's intended to protect domestic manufacturing. However, it makes the prices of goods higher. So that's actually going to end up hurting workers, which is why the workers are going to not vote for the Republican Party in 1890 and in the years after. So in 1884, a Democrat, Grover Cleveland, wins his first of two non-consecutive terms in office, and if you can see it, he does so by barely winning enough northern support. He carries the South, but not a ton in the South. Now, jump ahead to 1888. Benjamin Harrison is going to win this election over Grover Cleveland, much because he's able to carry the North. And then in 1892, which was an election we talked about in another episode on the populists, Grover Cleveland is able to win again. Even though he lost the election in the interim, he's able to come back to the presidency. Now, there's an economic depression that cripples him during his second term in office, so it really sort of makes him a forgettable president. Anyways, here are the four Gilded Age presidents: James Garfield, Chester Arthur, Grover Cleveland, Benjamin Harrison. You ever heard of any of them? Me neither. Benjamin Harrison was the first president to have electricity in the White House, but he was too scared to use it, so he didn't. Anyways, the presidents during the Gilded Age really blew. They were relatively weak, especially compared to political machines and the robber barons, who wielded much more power than them. J.P. Morgan, John D. Rockefeller, they ran the government. Which is weird. It's a good thing we don't have that today. Anyways, they were unable to initiate a lot of change, although the public wanted them to. ... That's going to bring us to the election of 1896, whereas you should have read about and you should have learned in the populism video, big money wins the day. Big money throws itself at the Republican candidate William McKinley because they feel like he'll be best for big business, and William Jennings Bryan, the candidate that carries a lot of the populist vote, loses, and McKinley wins in a modern election, in a sense that money buys it. Okay, anyways, William McKinley, we can talk shortly about him before we get on to our progressive presidents. He's elected largely because of the support by business elite. His presidency is largely remembered for the Spanish-American War and the institution of American imperialism. And anyways, he's lesser known, but important. He's assassinated too. So now we've had 3 presidents assassinated in a 36-year period. That's crazy. Once every 12 years a president is assassinated. That must mean that something is wrong with government. He's assassinated by a guy named Leon Czolgosz. Have fun with that one. And his vice president, Teddy Roosevelt, takes over. Dun, 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 dun. Here we go. So that takes us to the 3 progressive presidents: Teddy Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and Woodrow Wilson. We're going to handle them one at a time. Let's start with TR, or Teddy. Now, bear in mind here, I'm going to go back here and really emphasize this point. We are talking about these presidents and their domestic agendas. We're not talking about their foreign policy right now, because progressivism is something that's overwhelmingly done at home. So we're talking about the things that are going on in America. If you want to learn about these guys and their foreign policies, you have to, it's sort of discussed in the imperialism lessons and the World War I lessons. Less here, okay? This is domestic agendas. Okay, Teddy Roosevelt's domestic agenda is called the Square Deal because, of course, it had 3 parts, like all squares do. Anyways, you can remember the 3 parts by it being 3 C's. First, he wanted to control corporations. He gained the reputation of being a trust buster because he broke up a railroad trust called the Northern Securities Corporation that was run by J.P. Morgan because he thought it was unfair. In reality, he was more of a trust regulator. He wanted to identify bad trusts and take them out, like what he perceived the Northern Securities Corporation to be, and he wanted to leave good trusts alone. Example, he didn't bust up U.S. Steel, which at the time was owned by J.P. Morgan. He didn't bust up Standard Oil, which at the time was owned by John D. Rockefeller. So he sort of picked and chose his trusts to break up. Another way that he wanted to control corporations was by trying to limit strikes, because he thought strikes were bad and that they hurt consumers. So in 1902, there's a coal strike. Coal workers go on strike right before the winter. Now, what's bad about a coal strike right before the winter? People are going to freeze. So he steps in and he tells the coal companies and the miners, if you don't figure it out, the government's going to take over the mine and it's going to fire all the workers. Needless to say, they come to an agreement. The second C of Roosevelt's square deal is consumer protection. This is best illustrated by him advocating for the Food and Drug Administration and the Meat Inspection Act, both put in place in 1906, conveniently a year after The Jungle was published in 1905. Of course, we know the jungle. And then finally, the last C of Roosevelt's square deal is conservation. He passes in 1906 what's called the Antiquities Act, which sets aside land to not be touched so that future generations of Americans can have access to that land. Now, it paves the way for the National Park Service, which comes about in 1916. It's not created by TR, but largely because of him. Now, I want to take a moment to talk about conservation. So, Teddy Roosevelt was a conservationist. A conservationist is somebody who wants to very carefully choose what land we protect. Grand Canyon, protect it. Hetch Hetchy, which is a place where they built a dam around San Francisco, that's okay. You can, and that was in a national park, the National Park of Yosemite. That's okay. You can mess with that one. So he picked and chose, but for the most part, he was good to land, whereas most robber barons and Gilded Age type were not. On the flip side, there was a group known as the Preservationists, led by a guy named John Muir, who you should know for your test, P.S., and he was the head of a group called the Sierra Club, which was a group of preservationists that met in California that argued against any use of untouched land. He wanted to save it all. He wanted to preserve it. See, he kind of looks like a hippie, right? I think so. Anyways, to move on, look at this is a current map of national parks in America. As you notice, the dots and the stars and the green parts are areas set aside. Now, if I were to draw a line from, or just, let's take the Mississippi River as a point of escape, notice that there is way more stuff west of that river than there is east of the river. There's a lot of historic markers and stuff over here, but not many forests, not many national parks. Why do you think that is? Well, in 1900, what was developed? This was all developed. None of it was left to save. This, you could still save a lot of it. That's why today, if you want to get a national parks passport to keep track of which national parks you go to, better off going to the West Coast than the East Coast, because there's going to be a lot more for you to do. Okay, now, Teddy Roosevelt decides that he's not going to run for presidency in 1908, as he's said he's been in office long enough, and he is going to handpick his successor, William Howard Taft. So eloquently pictured here, of course, because he was our largest president, and he infamously got stuck in a bathtub. Poor guy. Anyways, so Taft is ushered in by TR, but he starts to do things that TR doesn't like. For example, he becomes an extreme trust buster. He busts U.S. Steel, one of the trusts that Teddy Roosevelt left alone. He is also not as conservationist as Roosevelt was. This is best exemplified by the Ballinger-Pinchot affair, which is where William Howard Taft hired on as Secretary of the Interior a guy named Ballinger, and long-standing Teddy Roosevelt appointee Gifford Pinchot starts to criticize Ballinger, and for that, William Howard Taft fires Pinchot. So when you fire TR's buddy, TR's not going to be happy, and Roosevelt starts to see Taft as not as progressive enough. So Taft's 4 years in office end, and who comes back? Teddy Roosevelt. So TR comes back, and there's the bathtub. And the bathtub traveled around for many years, and you could sit in it. And notice, this was the bathtub that they had to install in the White House after Taft got stuck so that he wouldn't get stuck again. It fit 4 dudes. Anyways, it looks kind of like a hot tub. All right, so in the 1912 election, pits these three guys against one another. Teddy Roosevelt is going to pick up the torch of the Progressive or the Bull Moose Party because he thinks William Howard Taft is doing a bad job. Woodrow Wilson is going to be your Democratic candidate, and William Howard Taft, your Republican candidate. Now, the new party here is the Progressive Party, and here is the platform of the Progressive Party. You can go ahead and pause it and read it if you want to get sort of an idea on where Teddy Roosevelt is coming from, but I just want to notice a couple of things. Prohibition of child workers, minimum wage standards, general prohibition of night work for women, which is a bit misogynistic and paternalistic if you ask me, but, you know, nobody does. No people can claim to be a true democracy which denies political rights on account of sex, which means give women the right to vote. Now, that's pretty progressive in 1912 because if you know anything, women don't get the right to vote for another 8 years. So the Progressive Party is pretty progressive. Okay, so Roosevelt is really trying to strike a chord with a lot of America. Anyways, there's a fourth candidate that comes. Eugene Debs, who you might remember from the Pullman strike because he orchestrated it in 1893. Anyways, he runs for president from jail, gets 1 million votes, but not enough to really do anything. And the socialists, again, are defeated. So sad. So sad. Okay, anyways, the election ends out like this. And you might look at this and say, wow, that was a landslide. Look at the electoral votes. Woodrow Wilson kills the other two. But if you look at the popular vote, it just so happens that the Republicans and the Bull Moose Party or the Progressive Party split their vote. That's almost 50% of voters, a little bit more than 50% of voters, which means had Roosevelt and Taft not had a falling out, things might have been different. Okay, Woodrow Wilson gets into office and he claims new freedom for the American people, and this is what new freedom is going to look like. He's going to say, initially, all trusts are bad, but then he's going to look at it a little bit more closely, and he's going to pass the Clayton Antitrust Act, which was the strictest antitrust legislation up until that point. But it gives him sort of the right to decide which trusts are good, which trusts are bad, sort of a la TR. But what he takes it a step further, he creates the FTC, or the Federal Trade Commission, which is still around today. It basically decides what trusts are okay and what trusts are bad. So like if two cell phone companies, T-Mobile and Sprint, want to merge together, the FTC is going to say whether it's good or bad for consumers. Kind of gives a lot of power to the federal government. Remember that. Wilson has the idea that tariffs are bad for consumers, so he's going to pass what's called the Underwood tariff. It drops the previous tariff 15%. So if you recall, the McKinley tariff was passed in 1890. In 1913, you're going to have a drastic reduction in tariffs. He's also going to pass the 16th Amendment, or see through the passing of the 16th Amendment, which institutes a progressive income tax. Now, a progressive income tax basically says that you're taxed based on how much money you have. It's not like that. It's not like if you have $1 million, you're taxed at 50%, and you $500,000 of your money. It's much more complicated than that. I don't have time to go into it here, but if you don't believe me, look it up. All right, and then to continue new freedom, private bankers don't benefit consumers. So Woodrow Wilson is going to give the government a little bit more control of the economy and control of banks. He's going to institute the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, which creates the Federal Reserve Board, which is like a national bank. Almost. Andrew Jackson would be so sad. But anyways, the federal government is going to regulate the amount of money in circulation, which is something that they still do today. They also control interest rates. And then finally, he's going to institute worker reform. So an 8-hour day for all railroad workers. He's going to pass a child labor law, the Keating-Owen Act. And he's also going to start workers' compensation laws for federal employees. Now, federal employees aren't the ones who are usually screwed over by their employer. That's usually the private sector. But hey, it's a step in the right direction. And finally, political reforms. The 17th Amendment allows for the direct election of senators, and of course the 19th Amendment, women's suffrage. Who could forget that? So this brings us to the end of the Progressive Presidents. I want to close by giving you this. Overall, Progressive presidents change the office tremendously. You start to see an increase in the power and the scope of the president. They become a moral figure, and they also become an international figure. So like I said at the beginning, we were talking about domestic agendas. It's important to note the foreign policies of these guys as well. The Panama Canal, big stick diplomacy of being equated with TR, dollar diplomacy with Taft, World War I, of course, with Wilson. Now, this doesn't mean that these guys were good. in all ways. Okay, I want you to go ahead and finish there we go. Finish the sheet that you've been filling out during this whole thing to figure out what I mean by that. The last fun piece of information I'm going to give you is that Woodrow Wilson is my mother's favorite president because she thinks he was the most handsome. This is Mr. Olson signing off. Peace.